My name's David Reynolds, and I never thought I'd be telling a story like this. I'm 32, a web developer by trade, and I've lived in Brooklyn for the last 8 years. Brooklyn's always had this unique charm to it, the kind that balances chaos and comfort. You've got the noise of the city, sure, but you can still find those little pockets of quiet if you know where to look. I found my own little slice of peace in this modest 2-bedroom apartment, tucked away from the bustling streets about 3 years ago. It wasn't anything special, but it was mine. Or at least it felt like mine. Now, rent in Brooklyn is no joke, and as much as I loved having the place to myself, I needed help. I've never been one for roommates, to be honest. I mean, I had my share of terrible ones back in college, like everyone else, but when it comes to my space now, I like it clean, organized, and most of all, quiet. So, a few months ago, when I put out an ad looking for someone to split the rent with, I wasn't looking for much. Just someone who'd respect the space. Enter Alex. When Alex first came by to check out the place, he seemed normal enough. Quiet, almost painfully so, but that's what I wanted, right? He had this withdrawn demeanor, kept his head down, didn't say much during our brief conversation. I remember thinking, this guy's perfect. No loud parties, no constant chatter, no drama. He moved in the next day, no fuss, and things seemed fine at first. But looking back, there was something off about Alex right from the beginning. I didn't notice it at the time because I wasn't paying attention. I mean, I wasn't exactly eager to be best friends with my new roommate, you know? As long as he paid his share and didn't cause problems, I was cool with keeping things distant. The first couple of nights went by without incident. I barely saw him, which, again, I thought was ideal. He'd slip into his room right after work and stay there. Not a peep. I never heard the door open at night. Never heard him in the kitchen. Not even the sound of him brushing his teeth or running the shower. At first I thought maybe he was just being considerate, trying to keep the noise down. But it started to feel a little unnatural, like too much silence, if that makes any sense. And then I realized I never actually saw him leave the apartment. I remember this one night. I was coming home late from work, and the hallway was dark, just the faint light coming in from the street outside. I fumbled with my keys, already half asleep, and as I opened the door, I noticed Alex's bedroom door was cracked open. There wasn't any light coming from inside, but I could feel this strange pull, like something was watching me from the darkness. I shook it off, told myself it was nothing, and went to bed. But that feeling stayed with me, you know? That weird sense that something wasn't right. The next morning, his door was shut, his bed made perfectly, almost too perfectly, like no one had slept in it at all. I brushed it off at first, figured maybe he had some weird habits or liked to sleep on the couch or something. People are quirky, right? And I wasn't exactly looking to pry. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing more things. Little things that on their own wouldn't raise any red flags, but together, they started to build this creeping unease. It was subtle at first. I'd come home and swear I heard breathing, soft, steady breathing, but only when I was near his door. I'd stop and listen, trying to convince myself it was just the apartment creaking or the wind outside. But it felt too human, and yet, whenever I tried to catch Alex in the act, the sound would stop. I'd knock on his door, ask if everything was okay, but he never answered. Not once. I'd tell myself it didn't matter, that maybe he was just one of those reclusive types. I mean, people like that exist, right? Guys who don't really interact with the world, keep to themselves, live in their heads. It wasn't my business to question how he lived his life, but it got to a point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. Not when every night I'd hear that same rhythmic breathing, closer and closer. And the worst part? I never saw him, not leaving for work, not coming home, nothing. It was as if he existed only in that room, like a ghost haunting the space between four walls. Of course, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. After all, living in New York can do that to a person. Stress, exhaustion, a bit too much caffeine. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. Something about Alex wasn't right. As the weeks dragged on, the sense of unease in the apartment only grew stronger. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but everything about Alex felt wrong. The strangest part was his bed, always perfectly made. Now, I'm not one to judge how someone lives, but it was like he never even touched it. Every morning I'd see the covers neatly tucked, not a wrinkle out of place. And yet, every night I'd hear those breaths, low and steady, coming from his room, like someone or something was there. I tried not to think too much about it at first. I mean, who hasn't had a weird roommate, right? Maybe Alex was just eccentric. But as the days turned into weeks, I started noticing more than just the bed. Little things that seemed harmless on their own. But together they painted a disturbing picture. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision when I walked past his door, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. And the whispers, God, the whispers. I'd be sitting in the living room minding my own business, and I'd swear I heard voices. Not loud, not clear, just these faint, almost unintelligible murmurs, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. At first I thought it was coming from the neighbors or the street outside. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was coming from inside the apartment. And it always seemed to be coming from his room. I'd try to shake it off, tell myself I was imagining things, but every night it got worse. The breathing, the shadows, the whispers. It was as if the apartment itself had become alive, pulsing with this unseen energy that grew stronger every day. And then there was Alex, or the lack of him, really. I never saw him leave, never saw him eat, drink, or do anything a normal person would do. It was like he existed only in that room, like some kind of phantom. Sometimes I'd hear the faint sound of footsteps shuffling across the floor. But when I opened the door, the room would be empty, his bed made, just like always. I started questioning everything. Was Alex even real? Or had I somehow conjured him up in my mind? The paranoia was eating away at me, and I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Every time I passed his door, that damn breathing would follow me, like an invisible presence stalking my every move. I thought about confronting him, but something held me back. Fear, maybe, or a sick sense of curiosity. What was he doing in there? And more importantly, why did it feel like he was waiting for something? I couldn't shake the feeling that Alex wasn't just a regular guy with odd habits. There was something darker at play, something I couldn't quite grasp but could feel in the pit of my stomach. It was like he wasn't really living there at all, more like he was biding his time, watching, waiting for something to happen. I told myself it would pass, that I was overthinking it, that maybe I was just tired. But every night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to that breathing through the thin walls, growing louder and closer. It wasn't going away. One night it all became too much. I couldn't take the constant tension, the feeling of being watched, the oppressive silence broken only by that infernal breathing. My nerves were frayed and I knew something had to give. I had to confront Alex, find out what was really going on behind that door. I waited until the breathing started again, that deep, slow rhythm I'd come to dread. It was louder than usual that night, almost like it was coming from right outside my door. My heart was pounding in my chest as I approached his room, trying to summon the courage to knock. The hallway felt darker than usual, the air thick with a strange heaviness, like something was pressing down on me. When I reached Alex's door, I hesitated for a moment, my hand raised to knock. But before I could, the door creaked open on its own, just a crack. The sight of that sliver of darkness sent a shiver down my spine, but I pushed the door open the rest of the way, determined to face whatever was on the other side. Alex was standing in the middle of the room facing me. His eyes, God, his eyes. They were hollow, like deep, dark voids that seemed to swallow the dim light from the hallway. His face was pale, almost translucent, and that eerie smile, just a slight curl of his lips, stretched across his face. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words caught in my throat. It was like I had forgotten how to speak. Alex, I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling. What? What are you doing? He didn't answer. He just stood there, that unsettling smile frozen on his face. His eyes locked onto mine, but it felt like he was looking through me, like I wasn't even there. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Why don't you ever leave? Why do I hear you breathing at night? For the first time, he moved, just a small, slow tilt of his head like he was considering my questions. Then in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, he said, "You'll see." That was it. That was all he said. And before I could react, he turned, walked to the window, and vanished. Just like that. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. The air in the room seemed to shift, like the atmosphere had changed the second he disappeared. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. Did he jump out the window? No. I was on the 3rd floor and the window was closed. There was no way he could have just vanished. The room was dead silent now, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger. I felt like something was in the room with me, something I couldn't see but knew was there. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, and slammed the door shut. For the rest of the night, I sat in the living room, too afraid to go back to my own room. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alex's face, those empty, soulless eyes staring back at me. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something irreversible. The next morning, I checked Alex's room again. His bed was perfectly made, his belongings still there, but there was no trace of him. No sign that he had ever been there at all. After that night, things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse, much worse. I thought Alex's disappearance would bring some kind of relief, that maybe now I could move on, forget about the strange things that had been happening. But it didn't. Instead, the apartment felt more alive than ever. Alive in the worst possible way. It started small, like it always does. I'd hear the breathing again, only now it was louder, more deliberate, almost like it was following me. I'd be in the kitchen making coffee, and I'd hear it right behind me. I'd freeze, heart pounding, waiting for it to stop. But it never did. And the worst part? Alex's room was still locked. I had made sure of that. Yet the breathing was there, night after night. One evening I tried something. I figured maybe if I locked his room, really locked it, it would all go away. So I bought a deadbolt, installed it myself, and sealed the door shut. For a while it seemed to work. The noises stopped, the whispers faded, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Just a little. But then, something new started happening. It wasn't the breathing anymore. No, now it was the feeling. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but every time I walked past Alex's room, I felt like I was being watched. Not just a casual glance either. This was something more, something deeper. It felt like eyes were burning into the back of my head, following me as I moved around the apartment. It got so bad that I avoided that part of the hallway altogether. I'd take the long way around, through the living room, just so I wouldn't have to pass his door. But even then, the feeling stayed with me, lingering, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. And then, the dreams started. At first, they were vague, just flashes of Alex's face, that eerie smile, his empty eyes staring at me from the darkness. But as the nights went on, the dreams became more vivid. I'd find myself standing in front of his door, the deadbolt undone, the door slowly creaking open, and inside I'd see him, standing there just like before, watching me with that same lifeless expression. In the dreams, I wanted to run, scream, anything to get away, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in that moment as the darkness from his room swallowed me whole. Waking up didn't feel like relief anymore. The dreams were bad, sure, but what was worse was the creeping sense that they weren't just dreams. Every morning, I'd wake up with the same feeling, the same awareness that something was off, that something was still there with me. I couldn't escape it, not even in the daylight. And every time I walked past his door, I swore I could hear the faintest whisper, just a single word over and over, soon. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. My work started to suffer. I couldn't concentrate on anything, couldn't focus on the simplest tasks. My mind was always on that door, on what might be waiting for me behind it. I thought about calling someone, maybe even telling a friend about what was happening, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Who would believe me? Hell, I barely believed myself. But it didn't matter. The feeling didn't care if I believed in it or not. It was always there, always pressing in on me, wearing me down. I was barely sleeping anymore. The bags under my eyes were a constant reminder that no matter how tired I was, no matter how much I wanted to forget, I couldn't escape what was happening. And then one night, it all came to a head. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to sleep. The apartment was dead silent, but I knew better than to trust that silence. Sure enough, after a few minutes, I heard it. The breathing. But this time, it wasn't coming from Alex's room. It was coming from the hallway, right outside my door. I lay there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat as the sound grew louder, closer. For a second, I thought about getting up, about throwing open the door and confronting whatever was out there. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, every muscle in my body locked in place. The breathing was right outside my door now, heavy and deliberate, like it was waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the morning finally came, I got out of bed, my legs shaky, my heart still racing from the night before. I walked to the door, half expecting to find it wide open, but it was still locked, just like I had left it. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing. But deep down, I knew better. That was when I decided I had to get out. I couldn't live there anymore. Whatever was happening, whatever Alex had brought with him, it wasn't going away. It was only getting worse, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it would escalate. Weeks later, I finally made the decision to move. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer, not with everything that had been happening. I figured once I was out, I could put all of this behind me. Forget about Alex, about the breathing, the shadows, the whispers. I started packing my things, putting the place up for rent. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't going to be that easy. It felt like something had already attached itself to me, something I couldn't just walk away from. The last few nights before I left were the worst. Every time I thought I'd get some relief, the apartment would find new ways to torment me. The breathing didn't just stop outside my door anymore. It followed me into every room, always just on the edge of hearing, never letting me forget. And it wasn't just the breathing. The sensation of being watched grew stronger, like eyes were boring into me from every corner of the apartment. Even when I wasn't near Alex's room, I didn't dare go into his room again. I hadn't touched the door since I locked it with the deadbolt. And yet, every time I walked by, I felt the pull of it, like something was on the other side waiting for me to open it. I didn't. I couldn't. But the presence was everywhere now. I could feel it in the kitchen, in the bathroom. Even when I sat in the living room trying to distract myself with TV, it didn't matter where I went. The apartment was no longer just a place I lived in. It was alive, and it had its sights set on me. The night before I was set to leave, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the apartment sending a jolt of fear through me, but the breathing never came that night. Instead, it was something else. It started with a soft knock, barely audible but unmistakable. I sat up, straining to hear where it was coming from, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time, from the direction of Alex's room. I got out of bed, my legs shaky, and crept toward the hallway. The apartment was dark, the air thick with a sense of dread that seemed to weigh down on me. I stopped in front of Alex's door, staring at the deadbolt, willing myself not to touch it. But then, there was another knock. This time louder, more insistent, like whatever was inside was demanding to be let out. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I reached out and touched the door. The second my fingers brushed the wood, I felt a chill run through me, and I jerked my hand back. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what was inside. But at that moment, I knew that whatever was in there wasn't going to stay locked away forever. The knock came again, and this time it was followed by a low, rasping voice. A voice I hadn't heard since that night when Alex disappeared. "Soon," it whispered. "Soon." I backed away from the door, my heart racing, and ran back to my room. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there staring at the locked door, waiting for something to come through. But it never did. The next morning, I packed up the last of my things and left. I didn't even bother to lock the apartment behind me. I just wanted to be out of there, to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. For a while, I thought maybe I'd finally escaped. The first few days in my new apartment were quiet. Too quiet. I tried to settle into my new routine, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing there, just out of sight. And then it happened. One night, as I was lying in bed in my new place, I heard it again. The breathing, low and steady just like before. My heart sank as the realization hit me. I hadn't left it behind. Whatever Alex was, whatever he had become, had followed me. It wasn't tied to the apartment. It was tied to me. Now no matter where I go, I can feel it. The breathing is always there, just on the edge of hearing, waiting. Sometimes I catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, but when I turn, there's nothing there. And every night, without fail, I hear the same word whispered softly from the darkness. Soon. I don't know what's coming, but I know it's only a matter of time before Alex shows himself again. And when he does, I don't think I'll be able to run. There's no escape from this. Whatever he is, whatever he's become, he's a part of me now. And I can feel him getting closer.
I've always been a bit of a loner. It's not that I don't like people, but I value my space. It's comforting, to have somewhere that's just yours. My little apartment in Brooklyn had been that safe haven for the past 3 years. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, nothing too glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me the freedom to create my own schedule. There was something about being in control of my environment that kept me grounded, especially when everything else in life felt like a whirlwind. I've had roommates before, but I always dreaded it. Sharing your personal space with a stranger never feels natural. It's like inviting someone into your mind, into your sanctuary. But rent in New York is unforgiving, and I needed to cut costs. That's when Olivia came into the picture. We met through a mutual friend, a friend who swore she was reliable and quiet. "You'll barely know she's there," they said. Olivia was polite when we first met, reserved even. She wasn't someone who offered much about herself, and that was fine with me. It's not like I was looking for a best friend, just someone who paid their half of the rent and kept things relatively peaceful. When she moved in, though, the first thing I noticed was this enormous, old-fashioned mirror. I'm talking massive, the kind of mirror that belonged in some old Victorian mansion, not a Brooklyn apartment. The frame was this heavy, gilded thing, with intricate carvings that made it seem alive, like if you stared long enough, you could almost see it breathe. Olivia mentioned, in passing, that it had been in her family for generations, but she didn't elaborate much. I didn't press her. We all have our strange attachments to things, right? But still, that mirror was unsettling. At first, it was just a minor irritation. It sat in the corner of our living room, looming over everything like it didn't belong, like it was watching us. But Olivia insisted on keeping it there, saying it needed to stay in a communal space. I didn't argue. I figured I'd get used to it, except I didn't. There was something off about it. You know that feeling you get when you walk into a room and the air just feels heavier? That's what it was like whenever I was near it. The air felt dense, almost suffocating. But it was subtle enough that I brushed it off at first. Just in your head, I told myself. I was probably just being dramatic, right? Besides, Olivia seemed completely unfazed by it. She went about her day like nothing was wrong, and part of me wondered if I was being overly sensitive. But as the weeks passed, that sense of unease started to grow. It wasn't like I was staring into the mirror, trying to find something creepy, but every time I caught a glimpse of myself in it, I felt wrong. My reflection looked back at me, but it wasn't me. There was something in the eyes, something darker, more hollow. Sometimes, when the light hit it just right, I'd catch what looked like a shadow moving behind me in the reflection. But when I turned around, nothing was there. I told myself it was just the lighting, or maybe I'd been staring at a screen too long and my eyes were playing tricks on me. And then there was Olivia. She was already quiet to begin with, but as time went on, she started spending more and more time just sitting in front of that mirror, not doing anything, just sitting there. I'd walk into the living room, and she'd be staring at herself, not moving, her eyes wide open, like she was in some kind of trance. It was weird, but again, I didn't want to make things awkward, so I didn't say anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every now and then, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and walk into the living room to get some water or just clear my head, and I'd find her there, sitting in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. It didn't matter what time it was. Olivia would be there, her eyes wide open, her face blank, like she was waiting for something. It creeped me out, but what could I say? "Hey, could you stop being weird with your mirror?" That wasn't going to happen. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that people have their quirks, and Olivia's was just this, unsettling attachment to an old family heirloom. But the longer she stayed in that apartment, the heavier everything felt. The air in the living room wasn't just thick anymore, it felt oppressive. And every time I looked at that mirror, I could feel something staring back at me, something that wasn't just my reflection. It got to the point where I stopped going into the living room at night. I didn't want to see her there, didn't want to catch a glimpse of myself in that cursed mirror. But even avoiding it didn't help. The feeling followed me, creeping into my bedroom, into my mind. It was like I could sense the mirror, even when I couldn't see it, like it was always there, lurking just outside my line of sight. And Olivia? She didn't seem to care. She acted like everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. not with that mirror looming in the corner, casting its strange, suffocating presence over everything. It started small, almost unnoticeable if I'm being honest. Just little things here and there that made me question whether it was all in my head or if something more sinister was happening. At first, I'd walk past the mirror and catch a glimpse of Olivia when I knew she wasn't even home. I figured maybe I'd just misremembered her schedule, or she'd come back without me noticing. But then it kept happening. Late at night, I'd wake up and get a glass of water, or maybe just step into the living room to clear my thoughts, and there she'd be. But it wasn't like seeing Olivia normally. Her reflection would be there, standing completely still, her eyes wide open, staring at herself, or, more accurately, staring at me. The first time it happened, I froze. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. My mind was grasping for any reasonable explanation, and eventually, I convinced myself that I'd been half asleep. You know how your brain plays tricks on you when you're tired? That's what I told myself. But it didn't stop. Night after night, I'd see her standing there, in the mirror, even though I knew she was fast asleep in her room. It was like her reflection had a life of its own, separate from her. And it wasn't just Olivia. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of myself, only it wasn't really me. My reflection would be twisted like I was in pain. My face, my body, distorted, almost grotesque. There were times when I couldn't even look at the mirror without feeling a chill run down my spine. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I'd tell myself that it was just my imagination, that maybe I was working too hard and not sleeping enough. But every time I walked past that mirror, I felt eyes on me, and it wasn't the normal kind of feeling. You know? This was different. It was wrong. Like whatever was in that mirror wasn't just looking, it was watching, waiting for something. Olivia didn't seem to notice, or worse, maybe she did and didn't care. She'd sit in front of the mirror for hours, just staring at her reflection, completely still. Sometimes I'd try to make conversation, ask her how her day was or what she was working on. But she barely responded, like she was lost in a trance, her eyes never leaving the glass. The Olivia I first met was fading, becoming more and more distant, as if the person I once shared this space with was slowly being replaced by something else. There were moments when I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, convinced I'd heard her whisper my name. I'd lie there, too afraid to move, listening for the sound again. But it never came, not in the way I expected. Instead, it was the silence that was terrifying, the kind of silence that felt too thick, too heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to avoid the mirror as much as possible, but how do you ignore something that's right there, in the center of your home? Every time I walked through the living room, I could feel its pull, like it wanted me to look, wanted me to see something. And when I did look, when I couldn't help myself, I'd see her. Olivia, standing there in the reflection, her eyes wide and empty, staring back at me like she knew something I didn't. At one point, I even tried to confront her about it. "Do you ever feel weird around the mirror?" I asked her one morning, trying to sound casual, like I wasn't losing my mind. Olivia just looked at me, her face blank, as if she didn't understand the question. "No," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "It's just a mirror." And that was it. No explanation, no acknowledgement that anything was strange. She just went on with her day as if nothing had happened, leaving me standing there, wondering if I was the one going crazy. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Something was wrong with that mirror. And whatever it wasn't going away. In fact, it seemed to be getting worse. The feeling of being watched wasn't confined to the living room anymore. It followed me everywhere. No matter what I did, no matter where I went in the apartment, I could feel it. And the worst part? Olivia's reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else. Something more than just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was getting closer. When I woke up that morning, Olivia was gone. It wasn't like she had packed up and left in the middle of the night. Her things were still there, untouched, as if she had just stepped out for a moment. Her bed was made, her clothes hung neatly in the closet, her toothbrush still resting by the sink. Everything was in place, except for Olivia. I tried calling her, of course. Left her a few texts. No response. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she'd gone out early, or maybe she just needed some space. I mean, she'd always been a bit of a mystery, and I figured this was just another one of those moments where she'd show up a day later with some vague explanation and a shrug. But as the hours passed and the sun began to dip below the skyline, the knot in my stomach started to twist tighter. The police weren't much help either. I reported her missing, but they treated it like she'd just decided to disappear on her own. Adults can leave without notice, they said. Give it a few days. But I knew, this wasn't normal. Olivia wouldn't just vanish like that. There was something wrong, something far deeper than anyone could see. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it had to do with that damned mirror. The apartment felt eerily quiet without her. Empty, in a way that didn't make sense, because all of her things were still there. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. I started avoiding the living room altogether. I couldn't stand the sight of that mirror sitting there, so still and perfect, like it was mocking me. Every time I passed it, I felt Olivia's presence. Not her presence. Like she was still there, but just out of reach. Maybe in the reflection, maybe somewhere else entirely. It wasn't long before the reflection in the mirror became more than just a distortion. It was Olivia. I'd see her standing behind me when I looked into the glass, only she wasn't like I remembered. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale, and there was something off about the way she stood. It wasn't human. It wasn't Olivia. Not anymore. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked, hoping that would keep the creeping dread at bay. It didn't. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, feeling like something was watching me through the walls, through the mirror. The apartment felt smaller, like it was closing in on me. And every time I passed by that cursed mirror, I saw her, always there, always watching. There were nights where I would sit on the edge of my bed, staring at my door, half expecting it to creak open on its own. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. I'd hear whispers in the dark, but when I turned on the light, everything was still. I tried to convince myself that it was the stress, the fear of Olivia's disappearance getting to me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The longer Olivia was gone, the worse it got. Her reflection wasn't just in the mirror anymore, it was everywhere. I'd see her out of the corner of my eye when I was brushing my teeth, or standing in the hallway when I passed by. But when I'd turned to look, she was gone. It was like she was haunting me, like she was trapped, but not in the way you'd expect. She wasn't a ghost. No, it was something else entirely. I don't know when it happened, but I started to avoid the mirror entirely. I'd keep my eyes down when I walked past, refusing to acknowledge the figure I knew would be there. But even without looking, I could feel her. Her cold, empty stare followed me everywhere I went. It wasn't just the reflection that haunted me. It was the feeling that she was still here somehow. I thought maybe I could escape it, leave the apartment, move somewhere far away and forget about the whole thing. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind. If she was trapped in the mirror, how long would it be before she found a way out? The more I thought about it, the more it consumed me. Every shadow, every creak in the floorboards felt like her presence, creeping closer, ready to step out of the glass and into my world. The days dragged on, but Olivia's presence only grew stronger. Every night, like clockwork, I felt her watching me through that mirror, though I never dared look directly at it anymore. I tried to carry on with life as if things were normal, but how could they be? Something was terribly wrong. At first, I considered taking the mirror down, maybe throwing it out entirely. But every time I got close to it, I'd freeze. My hands would shake, and a deep, primal fear would well up inside me, paralyzing me before I could even touch the frame. I'd stand there, staring at the reflection, trying to convince myself that it was just a mirror, just an object. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I so much as laid a finger on it, something horrible would happen. Something I couldn't take back. Instead, I opted for something easier. I covered it with a sheet. I thought foolishly that maybe that would help. Out of sight, out of mind, right? But that night, I woke up to the sound of something dragging across the floor. The kind of sound that makes your heart pound instantly, your body frozen in place. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to see what had made that sound, but I had to. Slowly, I crept into the living room, and there it was. The sheet was on the floor, crumpled in a heap at the base of the mirror. And the mirror? It was back, uncovered, reflecting the dim light of the moon creeping in through the window. My eyes darted to the reflection before I could stop myself, and there she was, Olivia. Standing behind me, her hollow eyes fixed on my back. I whipped around, but the room was empty. Empty, except for the mirror, which now felt like a living, breathing entity, mocking me with its silence. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? Every creak, every shadow, every subtle change in the light felt like a warning, like something was creeping closer and closer. I locked myself in my room, but even that didn't feel like enough. I could still feel her, lurking just outside my door, waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. The whispers began not long after that. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe the pipes, but as the nights passed, the sounds grew more distinct. They were voices, soft, barely audible at first, but always saying my name. Amanda. It came from every direction, echoing through the walls, through the mirror. Sometimes I'd wake up, convinced that Olivia was standing at the foot of my bed, whispering to me, beckoning me to look at her. But every time I opened my eyes, the room was empty, except for that oppressive, suffocating feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that the stress of Olivia's disappearance was getting to me. But how could I explain the way the mirror seemed to move? It started small, a shift in its angle here, a slight change in its position there. But then it became undeniable. One morning, I woke up to find it leaning against the wall directly outside my bedroom. I hadn't moved it. I knew I hadn't moved it. Panic began to set in. What had once been subtle, just a strange feeling or an off-kilter reflection, was now unmistakable. The mirror was alive in some way, tied to Olivia's disappearance. Or maybe Olivia herself had become part of it. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. But the mirror seemed intent on revealing whatever twisted secret it held, and I couldn't escape it. There were moments when I thought about smashing it, shattering the glass into 1,000 pieces just to be free of it. But something always stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Fear that breaking the mirror would only release whatever was trapped inside. Fear that destroying it wouldn't end the nightmare, but make it worse. As the days turned into weeks, I felt my grip on reality slipping. My reflection was no longer just mine. Sometimes when I looked into the glass, I didn't see myself at all. I saw Olivia, her twisted smile growing wider, her eyes darker, hungrier. And sometimes I saw things that couldn't be real, shadows moving in the background, hands reaching out from the edges of the frame. It was like the mirror was a doorway to something else, something far worse than I could ever comprehend. I started avoiding the apartment altogether, staying out as late as possible, trying to convince myself that if I wasn't there, it couldn't affect me. But it didn't matter. The mirror had a way of pulling me back like a magnet, and every time I returned, the atmosphere was darker, heavier, as if the walls were closing in. I knew deep down that something was coming, something I couldn't stop. One night, I woke up to a sound that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the usual creaks and groans of the old building settling, or the occasional hum of traffic outside. This was different. It was a low, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My heart immediately started pounding in my chest, and for a long moment, I lay there, paralyzed with fear, hoping that if I just stayed still, the sound would stop. But it didn't. It grew louder, closer, and I realized with a sickening dread that it was coming from the living room, the same room where that damned mirror stood. I knew what I would find if I got up, but a part of me needed to see it, needed to confirm that this wasn't just another nightmare. Slowly, I forced myself out of bed, my legs shaky, my breath shallow. As I crept down the hallway, the sound grew even more distinct. My mind raced with 100 different possibilities, none of them good. By the time I reached the doorway, the air was so thick with tension that I could barely breathe. And there, in the pale glow of the streetlights filtering through the window, I saw it. The mirror had moved again, but this time it wasn't just a subtle shift. It had been dragged, pulled almost closer to my bedroom door, as if it was slowly inching its way toward me. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was Olivia's reflection, staring back at me from inside the mirror. Her face was twisted into a grotesque smile, her lips stretched far too wide, her eyes black and empty. She wasn't just standing behind me anymore. She was reaching. Her hands pressed flat against the inside of the glass, as if she was trying to push her way out. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst from my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to move. Her hands slid along the surface of the mirror, her fingers tapping lightly against the glass, as if testing its strength. I could see her lips moving, though no sound came from them, but I knew what she was saying. She was calling my name, over and over again, in that soft, ghostly whisper that had haunted me for weeks. I don't know how long I stood there staring at her, trapped in that horrible moment. But eventually, something inside me snapped, and I bolted back to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, then shoved a chair under the handle, as if that would be enough to keep her out. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child, desperate for some kind of protection. But I could still feel her. Even from the other side of the door, I could feel her presence, pressing in on me, suffocating me with that same oppressive weight that had filled the apartment since the day she vanished. The next morning, the mirror was back in its original place, as if nothing had happened. But I knew she was still in there, waiting. And she was getting closer. Each night after that, the mirror would move a little further, inching its way toward my bedroom door. It didn't matter what I did, how many times I tried to push it back, or even cover it. The mirror would always end up where it wanted to be, and Olivia's reflection would be waiting for me, her twisted smile growing wider each time. It wasn't long before I realized what was happening. The mirror wasn't just some cursed object. It was a doorway, and Olivia hadn't been trapped inside it like I had thought. No, she had been preparing to cross over into my world. And once she did, there would be no going back. I could feel it deep in my bones. I tried to stay awake as long as I could, terrified of what would happen if I fell asleep. But exhaustion eventually won out, and one night I woke up to find the mirror right outside my bedroom door. Olivia's face pressed against the glass, her fingers tapping lightly against the surface. I knew then that it was only a matter of time. No matter what I did, no matter how far I ran, the mirror would follow. Olivia would follow, and when she finally stepped out of that mirror, she would take me with her. I can feel it now, her presence, stronger than ever. She's waiting for me to let my guard down, to give in to the fear. And when I do, she'll be there, ready to drag me into the darkness with her. There's nowhere left to hide.
It all started when I lost my place. You know how life can spiral out of control? And before you know it, you're sleeping on a friend's couch, scrolling through sketchy online ads trying to find something, anything, affordable. That's how I found Jack. Or rather, he found me. A laid-back guy in his mid-30s looking for a roommate to split rent in this old, quiet house just outside of town. When I met him, he seemed so easygoing, almost like he didn't have a care in the world. He made it sound perfect, and at that point, I couldn't afford to be picky. It wasn't like I had other options. My freelancing gigs weren't bringing in much, and I needed a place fast. Jack's offer was a lifesaver, or so I thought. I still remember walking into the house for the first time. It had this old-school charm, like something out of a forgotten era. There were heavy wooden doors, creaky floors, and the walls felt like they had seen things they weren't telling. The air smelled slightly damp, but not in a way that was immediately concerning. Jack barely showed me around. He wasn't the tour guide type. He handed me the key, showed me my room, a small but functional space with just enough room for my desk and a bed. And that was it. No house rules, no awkward expectations. He just said, "Make yourself at home, man," and left me to settle in. At first, I was relieved. The quietness of the house felt like a fresh start. After the chaos of my last few months, this place, with its stillness and solitude, seemed like exactly what I needed. Work was slow, but I could handle that. The house was so far out of town, barely anyone ever came by. No visitors, no distractions. Jack had his own life going on, though I couldn't quite figure out what he did for work. He was in and out at strange times, but I chalked it up to whatever mysterious job he had. I didn't ask questions. He was respectful of my space, and I returned the favor. It wasn't long before I settled into a routine. The days blended together in that lazy way they do when nothing urgent is pressing on you. I'd wake up, make coffee, spend a few hours working on my laptop, and by evening I'd wind down with a beer. Sometimes Jack would join me, but mostly he kept to himself. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of normalcy. It was a quiet life, and honestly, after the chaos I'd been through, it was a welcome relief. The only thing that stood out was how unbelievably still the house was, especially at night. When I'd turn off my lamp and lay in bed, the silence would wrap around me like a heavy blanket. At first it was calming, but then it started to feel unnatural. You know how sometimes a place can be too quiet? Like the silence isn't just the absence of noise, but something more. That's when I should have trusted my gut. But I didn't. The first few weeks were uneventful. Quiet, almost too quiet. Jack was easy to live with, always keeping to himself. Most nights he'd disappear into his room early, leaving the house shrouded in an eerie calm. But that was fine by me. I was focused on work, trying to rebuild after everything I'd lost. Still, there was something about that house, especially at night, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. At first it was just small things, little creaks in the floorboards, which I figured were normal in a place as old as that. But then the sounds started to change. Late at night, I'd hear footsteps pacing outside my door, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking up and down the hallway. I'd freeze, my heart thudding in my chest, but I never opened the door. I told myself it was probably Jack, though I never saw him. There were other noises too, low murmurs just beneath the surface of hearing, like someone whispering through the walls. I tried brushing it off. Maybe it was the pipes or the house settling. Old places like that have their quirks, right? But after a while it became impossible to ignore. One night I woke up to the sound of something moving in the walls. It wasn't just the usual creaking. It sounded like something alive, scuttling just beyond the plaster. My breath caught and I stared at the wall, waiting for the noise to stop. Eventually it did, but I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning I brought it up casually to Jack. I asked him if he ever heard strange noises at night, maybe rats in the walls or something. He just chuckled, shrugged it off. Old houses, man. They've all got their ghosts, he said with this half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I laughed along, but it didn't sit right with me. Something was off. And then there was Jack's behavior. He was mostly a ghost himself, slipping in and out of the house at odd hours. I'd hear the front door creak open in the middle of the night, followed by footsteps on the porch, and then silence. He'd be gone for hours, sometimes until dawn, and when he came back he'd act like nothing happened. No explanations, no details. If I asked, he'd just shrug and change the subject. I tried not to think about it too much, but the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern. Like clockwork, Jack would leave every few nights, always around the same time, always returning just before sunrise. It was strange, sure, but I figured maybe he had some late-night job or a hobby he didn't want to talk about. Whatever. It wasn't my business. But then the footsteps in the hall became more frequent, the whispers louder. Every night I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of someone or something moving just outside my room. It wasn't just in my head, I could feel it. The house was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. One night I couldn't take it anymore. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, got the better of me. It was the middle of the night when I heard Jack leave again, the front door creaking open and his footsteps disappearing into the darkness. My heart was racing, and before I knew it, I was slipping out of bed, pulling on my jacket and following him. I don't even know what I was thinking at the time. Maybe I thought I'd finally figure out what was going on, or maybe I just wanted proof that all of this wasn't in my head. The air outside was thick with the kind of cold that gets under your skin. The sky was pitch black, no stars, no moon, just a blanket of darkness overhead. I kept my distance as Jack moved through the yard, his figure almost blending into the shadows. He didn't seem to notice me following, or if he did, he didn't care. I was careful, sticking close to the trees, my breath coming out in quiet puffs, but my pulse was pounding in my ears. I don't know how long we walked. It felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes before he finally stopped. We were deep in the woods now, far enough that the house was completely out of sight. Jack stood in front of a massive oak tree, its twisted branches looming over him like skeletal arms. I stayed back, crouching behind a thick patch of bushes, my heart hammering in my chest as I watched. At first, Jack just stood there, unmoving. Then he started talking, but it wasn't normal talking. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and he was muttering something that I couldn't quite make out. It sounded like a chant, but the words weren't in any language I recognized. There was something unsettling about the way he spoke, like his voice was slipping in and out of reality, fading in one moment and becoming unnaturally loud the next. I was frozen, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. And then I realized something. There was no one else there. Jack was speaking to nothing, or at least nothing I could see. But the air around him, it felt wrong, thick, like it was alive, pulsing with some kind of dark energy that I couldn't explain. The shadows seemed to twist and move in ways they shouldn't, like they were alive, stretching out toward Jack, drawn to him. He stood there for what felt like forever, his voice blending into the night, the words becoming more urgent, more frantic. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Jack went quiet. He turned around and started walking back toward the house like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just been standing in the middle of the woods, chanting to some invisible force under a twisted old tree. I barely made it back to the house before him, slipping inside and closing my bedroom door as quietly as possible. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, my heart still racing. When Jack walked past my door a few minutes later, I held my breath, praying he wouldn't stop, wouldn't realize I had followed him. But he didn't. He went straight to his room, and the house fell silent again. I lay there for hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But there was no making sense of it. Jack wasn't just some oddball with weird habits. There was something else going on, something much darker. And I had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't over. The next morning, everything felt off. I don't know how else to describe it. The house, which had always been quiet, now felt suffocating. The air inside was heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite name. Jack was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sitting at the table with his usual cup of coffee, acting like nothing strange had happened the night before. He looked up at me and smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach turn. I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Jack in the woods, that eerie chanting, the way the shadows seemed to move around him like they were alive. And the worst part? The realization that none of this made sense. Who the hell was this guy? I spent the entire day in a kind of daze, going through the motions but barely present. I needed answers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was hiding something. Something Jack wasn't telling me. That evening, after Jack had left for one of his usual late-night outings, I decided to dig deeper. I started with the obvious, researching the house. It was old, and I figured maybe it had a weird history. Maybe there had been rumors about it. Something to explain the strange vibe, the noises, the creeping feeling of dread that seemed to fill every corner of the place. I didn't find much at first, just basic info about the property and its previous owners. But then I came across something that made my blood run cold. An article. It was old, buried in the archives of a local newspaper. The headline read, "Local man Jack Carter reported missing, presumed dead after 5 years." My heart dropped into my stomach. The date on the article? 5 years ago? I read through it, my hands shaking. Jack had been missing for 5 years, vanished without a trace, no leads, no body found. And yet, here he was, living in the same house with me, acting like nothing was out of the ordinary. It didn't make sense. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a different Jack. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew. The Jack I was living with, the Jack I'd been talking to, sharing meals with, was the same Jack who had disappeared 5 years ago. But if he was missing, if he was supposed to be dead, what the hell was living in this house with me? The pieces started falling into place. The strange noises, the way the house seemed alive at night, the shadows that moved in the dark. Jack hadn't just gone missing. He had become part of the house. Or maybe the house had become part of him. Either way, he wasn't human anymore. I felt sick. My head was spinning and I couldn't breathe. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't know how. The house, it wouldn't let me go. I could feel it now, pressing down on me like it was watching, waiting. And Jack? He wasn't just my roommate. He was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this world. I don't know how long I sat there staring at that article, trying to make sense of everything. But one thing was clear. I was in deep, too deep, and there was no way out. I knew I had to leave. There was no question about it anymore. Whatever Jack was, whatever the house was, I couldn't stay there another night. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and suddenly, every instinct in my body screamed for me to pack up and go. I grabbed my bag and started throwing things into it, my hands shaking, my breath coming in shallow bursts. But even as I was packing, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. That no matter how quickly I moved, the house had already tightened its grip on me. The air felt heavier than ever, thick and stifling, like it was pressing down on my chest, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the creaking floorboards under my feet weren't just old wood. They were alive, groaning with each step as if the house itself was watching. I threw the last of my stuff into my bag and swung the door open, ready to bolt for the front door. That's when I heard it. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway toward my room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was Jack. I could feel it, but this time, the sound of his footsteps wasn't just unnerving. It was final, like the sound of a predator closing in on its prey. I turned around just as Jack appeared in the doorway, his face emotionless, his eyes dark and empty. "You can't leave," he said, his voice low and hollow. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was more like a statement of fact, like he was just reminding me of a truth I had known all along but refused to acknowledge. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us stretched out, suffocating until it was all I could hear. I wanted to scream, to push past him, to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my mind blank with terror. I couldn't even speak. Jack stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "No one ever leaves," he said. And this time his voice was even quieter, almost a whisper. "The house won't let you." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me as his words sank in. The house. It wasn't just Jack. It wasn't just the strange noises, the whispers in the walls, or the feeling of being watched. It was the house itself. It was alive, and it had been waiting for me, just like it had waited for Jack. And now that it had me, it wasn't going to let me go. Jack turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving me standing there paralyzed with fear. I wanted to believe I could still make it out, that there was a way to escape. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house had claimed me, just like it had claimed Jack, and no matter what I did, no matter how fast I ran, there was no way out. I dropped my bag, sinking to the floor as the realization washed over me. I was trapped. The house had already won, and it was only a matter of time before I became part of it, just like Jack.